I'm here, but I'm coming.
Hey, Kathy.
Oh,
Oh, all right. Nobody's allowed to look serious here. It's not a serious day. Friday. Feedback Friday, that is.
Hello,
Hello.
Nancy Miller here.
Hello, Nancy.
love your shirt,
Oh, thanks.
blouse, whatever.
I just did this Eileen Fisher Renew jacket
Ooh,
weekend with some of our dyes. I was trying to do that
I'm
Rorschach
gonna
kind of thing and make it happy for this
You're
time.
wear
Kassia St Clair.
you're wearing that fabulous shirt that I saw on Instagram.
Yes.
ooh.
Hey, Ellen. Yeah, I just wanted something to be happy and not so muted.
Is it cotton or silk?
It's cotton. Yeah.
And you pre-mordanted it?
Why, yes, Suzanne, it is pre-mordanted.
Oh, and did you pre-mordant it with sulfate acetate? I mean,
Yes, some alum acetate from botanicalcolors.com. Some rock cochineal, coreopsis flowers, and logwood sawdust.
Hey.
Here comes the UPS guy.
Oh,
Woo! What's he doing today?
yeah, whenever Kathy is looking
No.
at the side, it's the UPS guy who she loves.
Oh, as he comes like bursting in here. Hold on, I gotta find my mask.
I see you, Mom.
Hi, Ellie.
Of course, I'm happy because it's raining in Tucson.
Woohoo!
And I'm happy because it's sunny and warm in Cambridge, and look at short sleeves.
Look at you.
Ooh.
Yahoo! Yeah, it's sunny and warm in Putney, Vermont too. It's in the 60s.
No.
Wow.
Yeah, and beautiful sunny, and all the snow is melting away like that.
Yeah.
It's very happy. Muddy, very muddy though.
Yeah.
Ugh,
It's
my-
sunny and warm in Southern California.
Yes.
There's a
That's
song
not
about
fair.
that. There's a
All
song.
right.
Too cold in Penzance,
Oh,
so
good.
enjoy it. Enjoy it.
Oh,
It's raining, it's foggy.
Lovely.
Breezy in
Ashley, that's our next song about the gloomy Penzance weather.
All right, Amy.
Yes, ma'am.
Are we ready? Oh, I messed up my coiffure.
Okay, fix yourself up
Nice
Darn.
sweater though.
where everybody sees you.
Thank you.
All right.
Here we go.
Let's get everybody to mute themselves and I will get your favorite song.
Kassia,
The hit song called Feedback Friday. All right. You guys all muted? Let's see. Okay, let's do it.
Well, it's the end of the week. Know where you been? Well, now it's Feedback Friday, so come on in. Come sit down and stare at your screen. We got a presenter that you never seen. We're Feedback Friday, we're on the loose. We'll be the train, you be the caboose. It's Feedback Friday with Kathy and Amy. Mashed potatoes and the gravy. It's Feedback Friday all day long. Feedback, feedback, Feedback Friday.
And good morning, everyone, from sunny but freezing Seattle. Welcome to Feedback Friday, episode number 46. OMG, 46 times we've done this. And we are so pleased to bring you this special episode. I'm Kathy Hattori, president of Botanical Colors, and joining me is Amy Dufo, our director of sustainability and social media. Amy is like
What?
the comedy part of our
Oh.
presentation,
I don't
but
think it works without you.
Yeah, I know, because it's fun to laugh at me, which is fine because I laugh a lot. Anyway, before we start, I just want to say thank you for staying with us for 46 seasons. It has been a year. If you have watched the news, you know that this is about the year anniversary of when we all went into lockdown. And I can just remember a year ago, we were flipping out because we didn't know what it was or how bad it was going to be or anything. And, you know, with Seattle being kind of the first outbreak in the United States, we were like double flipped out. I mean, the streets were empty. People were like in duck and cover mode. It was bad. So now we are doing much better, thank goodness. Sounds like if you're want to be vaccinated, you will have access to vaccines soon. So that's incredible. So I think we have some reason to celebrate. Also, we just passed some financial relief for people who are hurting, which for me, I think that's super important to remember that there are many, many people who've suffered greatly during this pandemic. So thank you for sticking with us. And just for some housekeeping, Amy's our moderator, and she'll be moderating questions from chat. So after the presentation by Kassia St Clair, we'll open it up and you can put your chat questions there, and we can just discuss all of the fascinating things we're about to hear. I'm so excited. My little paper is shaking. I'm going to say that I have a blurb that says, today we're joined by freelance journalist and author of The Secret Lives of Color, Kassia St Clair. I have to say, freelance journalist just doesn't begin to describe it. I mean, I think that Cassia is like this amazing storyteller with a historian's background who is really, she may be a journalist in her pursuit of facts and her, you know, development of her beautiful writing skill, but really all of these stories in this book have just really come alive. So we're very excited to welcome her. She's going to tell us in her book, The Secret Lives of Color, which chronicles the unusual stories of 75 different fascinating shades, dyes, and hues. So from blonde to ginger, the brown that changed the way battles were fought to the white that protected against the plague, Picasso's blue period to the charcoal on the cave walls at Lascaux, acid yellow to Kelly green, and from scarlet women to Imperial purple, these surprising stories run like a bright thread through history. So Cassia is going to talk about 5 of these colors in her presentation. 4 or 5. We hadn't quite. 5. Yay! And so Cassia, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm just reading really quickly here. Oh, after our presentation, we have picture of the week, and I'll announce it at that time. This call is being recorded and we'll have a video copy ready for you along with any additional information from this call. So now we're just going to seg into the presentation. Cassia, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Well, I'm just going to share my screen with you all. Hang on one second while I get it up and running. Oh, okay. Thank you all so much for joining me. Welcome to your computer screen. I'm really thrilled to be here today, and I'm also really thrilled to be talking about colours. As you've just heard, I'm the author of The Secret Lives of Colour and also The Golden Thread, which is my second book, which is about textiles. As you heard, The Secret Lives of Colour, I'm afraid this is the British version of my presentation. So there's a U in colour throughout, which I hope doesn't bother you all. I know it looks weird to an American audience. You'll just have to imagine me saying couleur. But yes, The Secret Lives of Colour contains 75 different stories about colours. I like to think of them a little bit like character sketches. I thought about trying to really quickly run through all 75, but even though I do speak quite fast, I think that would have been too much of a challenge. So I focused on 5 very different colors with very different stories. But I think what you'll see, sort of a common theme throughout all of them, is how important colours have been and still are, and the great lengths to which people have gone to in order to get their hands on really pure, vibrant, exciting colours that really mean something to them. The colour I'm going to start with first is ultramarine. It's one of my personal favourite colours, and I also think it's just got the most fabulous story to really lay out the importance of colour. If people aren't persuaded by colour, just in and of itself, this is the story that I tell them. So firstly, when I'm giving this talk live, what I would usually do at this point is ask people to raise their hand if blue is their favorite color. And usually a little more than half the room, probably around 60% of people, put up their hand. This is not surprising. Blue today, and since the Second World War, has consistently been the world's favorite color across gender, across continents. All different kinds of people love blue, but that hasn't always been the case. In fact, in a lot of ancient cultures, particularly in the West and based around Europe, blue was considered really unlucky. It wasn't widely used. It was associated with barbarism and had lots of negative connotations. But this really began to shift in medieval Europe around about the 12th century. You suddenly see this explosion of popularity. And one of the ways this can be charted, this kind of great change of opinion, is by looking at the devices used by aristocratic families. Very often they had sort of symbols associated with their house, and these were colored symbols. And suddenly blue goes from being one of the least popular, almost unused colors, to being in around 30 to 40% of all these heraldic devices. So this is a real clear indication that blue becomes a lot more popular. There are sort of two interconnected reasons for this great sea change in blue's fortunes in Europe. The first is to do with a pigment, and the second is to do with a woman. So the pigment is, of course, ultramarine, which is a pigment made from a semi-precious stone called lapis lazuli. And this pigment just really was beloved by artists. This quote that you can see on the screen is by a man called Cennino Cennini, who was quite often very scathing about the colors that he had access to, would often bemoan the fact that they lost potency if they were exposed to light or over time. And you get the sense reading his book that that colors are sort of difficult things that have to be kind of dragged out of materials and onto painted surfaces. They do not sound easy to wrangle at all, with the exception of ultramarine, which he goes on about for several pages. It's almost babbling how excited he is. This is just a small quote, but you can already see how excited he is by this particular blue, the most illustrious, beautiful, the most perfect. And you can sort of see why he gets so excited about it, because it's a very deep pigment. You can see a little portion of it there in a much later painting. It tends neither towards purple nor towards green. So it's a really wonderful, true blue that worked in a lot of mediums, but particularly in tempera that was used on walls. The woman who I mentioned, who was also really important in blue's fortunes, was of course the Virgin Mary. Very often when you look at medieval or Renaissance art, you'll see the Virgin Mary is depicted in blue. The reason is because ultramarine was becoming more illustrious and a more expensive pigment, and artists wanted to show their devotion to her by depicting her in this beautiful and very expensive pigment. It was a way of showing their devotion and of also honoring the church. And of course, this was important to patrons too. If you are commissioning an artist to create a work of art that's going to be in your local church and you're a wealthy merchant, you want to show off your devotion and wealth at the same time. And so you would quite often specify that a painting had to contain a certain amount of ultramarine, this very expensive pigment. It was a way of showing your wealth and showing your devotion. I absolutely adore this this painting by Giovanni Sassoferrato. You can actually find it online and zoom in to the section that is painted with this beautiful blue ultramarine pigment and just see the incredible detail and loving care with which this wonderful pigment has been used in this painting. You know, it almost feels like the face of the Virgin Mary is an afterthought, and the blue is being used as the medium with which to express how the artist felt about her, but also wanted the viewer to feel about her. The blue is communicating her spirituality and holiness. Why was this pigment so expensive? Well, this had a lot to do with where the raw material, the ultramarine, came from. This is a modern Google map of northeastern Afghanistan, and where the pin is a place called Sarasang, the Sarasang mines. And this is where almost all of the ultramarine used in medieval and Renaissance art came from. It had to be, let me see, I think, oh yes, there we go, to give you some idea of exactly where this is in the world and exactly how far it had to travel in order to make its way to Europe. Here's a little sort of a better indication. What would happen, oh, here we go. It was part of the Silk Road, which is how it was transported. So the ultramarine lapis lazuli would be taken up from the mine and would be put on, as big lumps of rock on the backs of camels and donkeys, along with other popularly traded goods like silk, and would enter the sort of stream of goods that was passing east and west, north and south, along these this network of trade routes that we now know as the Silk Road. And very luckily for the artists in Western Europe who were desperate to get their hands on ultramarine, the Sarasang mines were actually, although it's a very remote location, they were absolutely kind of in the middle of a sort of well-trodden part of this network of trade routes. So once the lapis lazuli stone had been taken up and had been transported on pack animals to the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, it would then be put on boats, and it would usually come into Europe through Venice, which was sort of the Europe's most prominent port, particularly for goods that were coming along into Europe along the Silk Roads. But even then, its journey wasn't done, because the stone, in order to become a pigment, would have to be ground down to a very fine powder, and then would be mixed with mastic and wax, and sort of kneaded a little bit like you might knead bread in a solution of lye. And as there's this, this physical action, as there's this kneading action, the blue part of the stone, the blue part of the lapis lazuli, falls out of this dough mixture and collects on the bottom in this lye solution. At the end, once you've extracted all the blue, you can pour off the lye and you're left with this usable blue pigment that can then be added to other mediums and used in works of art. So this pigment was incredibly sought after and incredibly expensive. At points, it was more expensive than gold. And this, of course, led to a great desire to find alternatives. There were other blue pigments, but nothing really matched ultramarine in terms of its vibrancy, in terms of its power, and in terms of its kind of cultural heft. Until that is, competitions started being run to try and find a chemical synthetic version of ultramarine. And in the 19th century, it was a synthetic version was finally discovered by some French chemists, which is why quite often now the modern pigment is known as French ultramarine. All that means is that it's ultramarine, but it's synthetic. It's created using this French method. And this resulted in a blue powder, which, unlike the real ultramarine, all the particle sizes in the synthetic version were all the same size, which initially led to quite a lot of resistance to, from artists. Artists were very attached to real ultramarine, and because the particle sizes were all different, the real ultramarine reflected the light in a really unique and individual way. No two samples of ultramarine were quite alike, and you got different levels of impurities in each, and the chemical structure would be slightly different. The synthetic version, however, was very even. And at first, this, like I said, this led to some resistance, but French or synthetic ultramarine did have a big point in its favor: price. It was up to 2,500 times cheaper than the real thing. And of course, it completely took over, and almost all the ultramarine you'll find in shops now, particularly if it's affordable, will be this synthetic version. The reason I've got this slide up is because people often talk about Yves Klein's blue, and that was actually synthetic ultramarine. But what he did, what he patented, his blue, was mixed with a certain type of resin, which he felt gave this synthetic ultramarine the real power and impact and punch to express its real true blueness. With the mediums that were available to him in the 60s, he felt they just weren't doing quite what he wanted. And so it was the new medium combined with a synthetic ultramarine that he called his blue, and that you can see on almost all his artworks, particularly his IKB series. So the next pigment I wanted to talk about, chrome yellow, came around in this same wave of chemical exploration and development, which led to synthetic ultramarine, also gave us chrome yellow. So there was a lot of investigation into different elements and the colors that they could provide. And one of these, chromium, was so called because of the Greek word for color, and it was discovered that chrome was able to produce a lot of colors, not just yellow but also orange and reds. One of the artists who's most associated with chrome yellow is Vincent van Gogh. I actually went to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam several years ago, and I asked the director if he could help me pronounce Van Gogh the way it should be pronounced. And he just looked at me and he said, "You're an English speaker, you're never going to be able to pronounce it. Just try your best." So I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing it the true way. But Vincent van Gogh is very associated with chrome yellow, in part because he used an awful lot of it. And in part because it was a very special color to him, and kind of ran like a bit of a sort of a running theme throughout his life. So in one of the kind of most sort of famous episodes from his life, he went down to Arles in southern France and stayed in the Yellow House in Arles. And his idea for this summer of 1888 was that he was going to create an artists' commune. He was going to collect together all the artists that he admired from the Impressionist group, and they were going to work together, and their creativity would feed off each other, and they would create art that the world had, never seen before, and that would really have this incredible impact. And the artist that he was most excited about coming to join him in this Yellow House was Gogh. He really admired Gogh, and he'd invited him, and Gogh had said that he would come, and Van Gogh was eagerly waiting his arrival and trying to make everything perfect for him. One of the ways in which he was doing this is he was preparing their studio in which he imagined them working together, and he wanted to decorate it in a style that befitted his hero. So he would go out every morning and collect fresh sunflowers from the fields, rush home before it got too hot, and paint them very, very quickly, because he found that if he didn't work fast enough, the sunflowers would begin to wilt and brown and go over. I mean, Van Gogh is a wonderful artist to look at in terms of pigments, because he was a very keen correspondent, and he talked a lot about the paints that he used, his methods, and colors. So here's sort of some wonderful quotes about this sort of series of sunflower paintings that he was working on, and the pigments that he used, one of which was chrome yellow, to get that real bright, vibrant effect with his sunflowers. When you go and see one of his sunflowers today, unfortunately, quite often they look quite brown and quite faded and dull. And this has led to people assuming that when he was painting them, he was very depressed, and that kind of gave this kind of darker cast to his paintings, because it was sort of psychologically he was struggling. I mean, in fact, quite the opposite. He intended for them to be very, very bright and vibrant and happy and optimistic. However, the chrome yellow he was using was a very new pigment, a very exciting pigment, and not the most reliable pigment. And tests now performed recently on these sunflower paintings have shown that in circumstances, the chrome yellow that he was using was darkening over time. And that is why they now look quite brown and wilted, quite the opposite effect from the one he was intending with all his efforts to get up so early. So this is just harking back to the kind of initial point that I made, that often pigments weren't very reliable and artists really struggled with them. Here we have a pigment that was very new, that was very exciting, that has been produced by this great new exciting wave of chemistry, which also sort of betrayed its user and ended up, darkening over time, and leading to people to have a slightly the wrong impression of this artist's work. Now to a very different color, and a color I imagine as dyers you may be familiar with the history of, Tyrian purple. It is one of the oldest dyes, particularly one of the most famous and illustrious dyes. It was first used, or its earliest history, it goes back to at least the 15th century BC, and was very popular with Roman emperors and Byzantine emperors. I couldn't actually find a great picture of many Roman emperors, so I have slightly cheated here. I hope you'll forgive me with a sort of a film still rather than something more authentic. But it is very tricky to get an exact color. We know how important this color was from written sources. They talk a lot about the association of this color with power and how it was used by different rulers. We have, a lot of knowledge of that, but the actual appearance is quite difficult to discern. There are quotes about it looking a little bit like clotted blood, which sounds neither very appealing, nor does it sound all that purple. I think when I tend to think of Imperial purple, I think of something a bit more, maybe like the Yahoo logo, maybe something like that, but something quite bright and vibrant, something a little bit like the purple you see in this image here. But actually the sources make it sound as if it was something much darker and much richer. Yeah, here we go. Here's that amazing quote about it being the color of clotted blood. And that's rather an amazing image to have when you're talking about power and color, to think that it might be the color of clotted blood that they're talking about. The raw material from which this color was summoned was actually two different types of sea snail native to the Mediterranean. And if you were to get your hands on one today and crack open its shell, you'd see a gland running across the back of the sea snail. And if you were to squeeze it onto a piece of cloth, the first thing that would hit you would be an aroma, which is said to be a little bit like garlic breath and rather unpleasant. if you were to squeeze this, the drop of liquid from this gland onto a piece of cloth, you'd see a chemical reaction taking place, and the cloth would change color: yellow, green, blue, and finally purple. But to get a really great saturated color fast dye, as I'm sure you're all aware, isn't quite that simple, and a lot of steps had to be gone through, particularly when you're talking about very quite relatively primitive dye methods. Some dye works have been unearthed that date back thousands of years. Usually they're found downwind of large cities, and this was very good reason. What would happen to these sea snails is large numbers of them would be gathered up and they'd be crushed, and they'd then be left to ferment for 9 or 10 days. Stale urine was often used for its ammonia content. And so the stench from these dye works really must have been quite overpowering. So there's a reason why they were often situated downwind of cities. But the cloth, the end result from these rather unappetizing raw materials was this potent symbol of power. Although there are some suggestions that the cloth did sometimes retain a slight whiff, particularly in the merchant shops. But the cost of the cloth, it could cost again as much as gold, and this led to restrictions on its use because it became so associated with power. There was a fear that it would be possible for people who were wealthy to wrongly usurp this symbol of power simply by buying the cloth. There's a very famous story about a recital attended by the Emperor Nero, who happened to catch sight of a woman in the audience illicitly wearing this colour. And he is said to have, I think we probably now call it throwing a bit of a hissy fit. He was said to have stopped the recital, grabbed this woman, had her stripped, had her properties confiscated, and had her whipped for the offence of usurping imperial purple. The dye's use really collapsed during the mid-15th century, in part because of the fall of Constantinople, and also because so many of these sea snails, the sea snail population had just been decimated by this huge appetite for this incredibly beautiful color. It took around 250,000 sea snails in order to make an ounce of dye. So you can imagine how many sea snails were being used. And after many centuries of use, they were becoming rarer and rarer, and the cloth more and more expensive, and the industry almost collapsed. Luckily for purple lovers, there was a great kind of revival in purple cloth in the 19th century, when William Henry Perkin, here he's shown as a sort of old and venerable man, but at the particular instant that I'm talking about, in 1856, he was just 18. He was a very keen chemist, and he was experimenting during the spring holidays in a little lab he'd put together in his father's attic in East London. And he was actually trying very desperately to find a cure for malaria. He was trying to make a synthetic quinine. This he never accomplished in his life, but on this particular day, he had a beaker that he was working on, in which he was distilling coal tar, and he found, much to his surprise, not a clear liquid, which might have indicated that he had indeed produced quinine, but a kind of sludgy, purpley, blackish color. This, some other scientist, some other person might have just thrown away, but we're very lucky that he didn't. He experimented on it further and found that it eventually produced a purple liquid. And when he dipped a piece of cloth into this liquid, it was discovered that he'd created a brilliant, ultra saturated, very bright purple dye. As it turned out, this was the first aniline dye and would birth a huge industry of aniline dyes and really change the way in which colors were applied to textiles and what colors meant. You know, before, colors had very much been tied to natural materials, insects, plants, roots, and so on and so forth. What, you know, Perkin did was to create this synthetic dye industry. You know, first it was mauve, his purple that he created, but afterwards there were aniline blacks and reds and yellows and oranges and greens, which really democratized color. Suddenly colors were available much more cheaply, and they were no longer tied to natural materials and trade routes. Unfortunately, they also sometimes suffered from color fastness problems, but the novelty of these ultra bright colors was such that it almost didn't matter. A very few years after he first created this purple, it was worn by Queen Victoria at the wedding of one of her daughters, and this created a fashion sensation, and so much so that a British newspaper proclaimed just a few years later that London had caught the mauve measles because it was so popular and so many people were wearing it. So finally, well, not finally, we've got two more to go. This is another rather incredible color that was applied to lots of things, including wallpaper and also fabrics. It was discovered by Carl Wilhelm Scheele in the 18th century when he was experimenting on arsenic. And was incredibly popular. I think people imagine that greens would be a very easy color to produce, but actually they've proven really tricky, both in terms of pigments and also in dyes. They're often quite fugitive. Medieval dyers, in order to get really good greens, often had to mix blues and yellows, which would then fade at different rates. And so it was a difficult color, and his discovery of his green, which was marketed under many different names, really prompted a great enthusiasm for the color green almost immediately. There's quite a famous story that Charles Dickens came back from a trip to Naples and announced to his wife that they were going to redecorate their whole home from basement to garret in this particular Scheele's green. And very luckily for Charles Dickens, his wife wasn't a fan of the color and forbade it. I say luckily for Dickens, because as it turned out, this color contained an awful lot of arsenic and could, under certain circumstances, prove fatal. It was discovered that various samples of wallpaper contained, just 2-inch squared, could contain enough arsenic to kill 2 people. But by this time it was just too late. This color had been so popular, it was on dress fabrics, wallpaper samples, and was also used a lot in artificial flowers. And there are awful stories of one in particular that was talked about in the newspaper in the mid 19th century was of a little girl who was given some artificial grapes by her mother to play with, and of course, as she's a young child, immediately she puts them in her mouth and dies almost immediately. But this was a real problem that manufacturers were very unwilling to tackle, because this was a very profitable color, and by this time it really was everywhere. One of its supposed victims, its most famous supposed victim, is Napoleon Bonaparte, who died on the island of St Helena. And when his body was exhumed about 40 years after his death, it was found that it was suspiciously well preserved. I'm not sure if you can hear in the background a kind of whooshing sound, but that is the rain absolutely yeah, and I think it's only going to get worse. I can barely see out of the window, so apologies if it sounds like I'm in the washing machine, but I basically am. So his body was exhumed, and it was found to be really well preserved, which was a classic sign of arsenic poisoning. And there'd already been quite a lot of suspicion that the English might have tried to sort of bump Napoleon off while they were under his care, and this only added to the rumours. It was thought that maybe a doctor or a visitor might have slipped him some arsenic. These allegations seem to be given extra strength when a sample of his wallpaper that was in his room on this island was tested and was found to contain an awful lot of Scheele's green. And this pigment was often proven to be quite especially dangerous in wet climates, because the water, if the wallpaper became damp, it would start to release arsenic laden fumes. And so this, seemed to be that this color might bear some responsibility for Napoleon's death. However, more recent studies have indicated that some samples of his hair were found and tested, and it is now believed that although his arsenic levels were very high for our era, they were not that unusually high for his, and that the arsenic levels in his hair indicate that the arsenic itself wouldn't have been responsible, although I doubt it helped. But yes, you'd think that this would lead people to change the laws immediately, but it didn't really happen, despite the fact that there was this very sort of, you can really hear it now. I'm actually a bit worried. I'm gonna get blown away. But there was sort of real resistance to the idea that you would want to stamp out the use of a color. Access to this green was too important, and there just wasn't the public support for really harsh laws that would totally prohibit this color, even though it could do serious harm, and that was understood. I'm afraid we're going from one slightly depressing, death-laden colour to another. But it's Friday, so just have a glass of wine. I don't know what time it is there. It's wine time here anyway. Mummy brown, which was actually made out of mummies and was an incredibly popular pigment, believe it or not, and led to a lot of discussions about which part of the mummy would be best for pigment, whether it was the bandages, or whether it was the bones, or whether it was the flesh that made the most charming brown pigment. But it was incredibly popular. It could be picked up in colour merchant shops. Obviously, mummification and mummified bodies were unfortunately really readily available. Lots of mummification was common for around 2,000 years in Egypt, and Europeans developed a real fascination with mummies, and also a real an interest in them as antiquarian objects. There were also a lot of treasure hunting, because it was often found that trinkets were bound up with mummified bodies, and obviously grave robbing had been a problem almost since the beginning of mummification. But also powdered mummy in a kind of sympathetic magic kind of way was beloved as a medicine. So yeah, mummies were used, had lots of uses, but the medicine, I think, is really surprising. So it was used as a toothpaste, was advised as a toothpaste, and King Philip of Spain who was I think a little bit of a hypochondriac, used to carry around with him a little bag of powdered mummy and powdered rhubarb, and anytime he was feeling a little bit under the weather, he would just quickly take some, and that would apparently make him feel much better. It was also recommended as a cure for epilepsy in Britain in the 16th century. But of course, the use that we're particularly interested in today is as a pigment. This pigment, horrifyingly, was used for a really long time into the 20th century. It was being produced and used. There are adverts placed in the Daily Mail in the early 20th century. And there's also this quote that I found in, I believe, Time magazine from the owner, the proprietor of a colour merchant shop, sort of talking about, the final few mummies that they had, that they were just then, getting rid of or sort of phasing out. It's very hard to think of a kind of positive spin on this story, but I think I did want to have sort of a little bit of brightness, and I think if there just one aspect, one bright spot comes from the reaction of Edward Burne-Jones. So while the pigment was called mummy and was brown, and there was an awareness in some circles of where this pigment came from, a lot of artists who were using it regularly had no idea that this brown pigment was actually made using mummified human remains. And there's a wonderful story about Edward Burne-Jones, who was an artist in London, and was hosting a Sunday lunch party for some family and friends. And one of his guests turned up atrociously late and apologized for his tardiness by saying, "I was watching the making of mummy brown pigment. I was watching, a body being crushed up for use as a pigment, and that's why I'm late." As excuses go, I kind of get it. It's a good one, but it did not impress his host one little bit. Edward Burne-Jones stopped the lunch party and ran up to his studio, white in the face, grabbed his, full tube and his kind of empty tube, nearly empty tube of mummy brown, ran out into the garden and insisted that all his lunch guests join him in giving these tubes of mummy brown, as he called them, a decent burial. And we actually know this story from two different sources, one of which is Edward Burne-Jones's sister, and the other one is Georgina. And the other one is Edward Burne-Jones's nephew, Rudyard Kipling, who wrote about 40 years later that this had made such an impression on him that he believed that he would still be able to dig a trowel within inches of where these two tubes of mummy brown pigment were buried. Yes, and so on that delightful note of some sort of redemption for the users of mummy brown, my talk has come to an end, just about on time, and hopefully you'll have some wonderful questions for me about colour or about textiles or anything else you care to ask.
Thank you, Kassia. Wow, that was so great. I knew about mummy brown, but I had no idea that it was so prevalent. Wow. Wow. All right, Amy, do you have questions?
Yes. Well, just one just came in because I just opened the chat box up. So here they come. All right. So somebody was asking about the covers of your book. Are they the same? I don't know, Suzanne, if you're talking about like the colors, the Secret Lives of Color or the Golden Thread and.
No, the US version does not have the U in color.
Oh, is that what we're talking? Okay.
I think that's what we're speaking about.
Yes, and also there is a different cover in the UK, the paperback version. If you open the US edition of The Secret Lives of Colour, the end papers are stripy, and the UK paperback is stripy. So there are different covers in the UK and the US.
I don't have stripy. I have blank.
Oh, you don't have stripy. Oh, maybe that was a different edition. Oh, I'm sorry, but there is.
That's okay. I have stripy here.
Okay.
Which I think is delightful.
There is a stripy end paper version, and there's the UK paperback is stripy, but they all contain the same colors. Only the American edition have no hues. I had to take all of them out, which was very tricky to get rid of them all.
My goodness.
Many on every single page.
Yes.
All right, let's see. Judy Albert's asking, what is an aniline dye?
So aniline dyes essentially was a byproduct of coal tar. So coal tar at that time was sort of a kind of a byproduct from gas lighting. It was understood that it was sort of super rich in lots of different interesting chemicals and components, and scientists were really fascinated by it. And they thought of it as kind of a potential raw material for a lot of different interesting chemical preparations. But they'd yet to really sort of crack all its uses. And the discovery of mauve, the first aniline dye, was sort of provided a kind of chink into this great new branch of chemistry. But essentially it's a synthetic dye based produced from coal tar, a byproduct of the chemical of the coal and gas industry. So they're, now obviously we feel very differently about them because it's not a renewable source. However, at the time it was very exciting because dyes at the time, for example, red was based on madder root, which had to be transported and was liable to fluctuations. If you had a bad season and the madder didn't grow as well, suddenly the prices would fluctuate wildly. And so the idea that you could produce something chemically from something as plentiful and seemingly never-ending as coal was really exciting and wonderful. And it's very funny to look back on it now with our 21st century eyes and to see all this utopian thinking in a very different light.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Let's see, is ultramarine is one of those things that just happened, maybe, that we were talking about earlier. Is ultramarine still mined in Afghanistan? Do you know?
So lapis lazuli is still mined. Obviously, ultramarine is the pigment made from lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli is still mined in Afghanistan, although new other sort of sources and mines have been discovered, I believe, in Central and South America, which is now where a lot of lapis lazuli comes from. But very little of it makes its way into ultramarine since the synthetic was developed. There's still a very niche, very small number, but it's incredibly expensive. You can go to your art shop and ask for real ultramarine, but it's not cheap, and it's chemically identical to synthetic ultramarine. So there's sort of this idea of why would you bother? But for artists at the time, just at the moment when the synthetic was discovered, the real ultramarine had this real resonance because of its huge history, because of the artists who had used it, because of the subtle differences in color, and because of its use to glorify the Virgin Mary. And so it had this real resonance. So yes, it is still mined, it is still made, but very little of it goes towards making pigments.
Let's see, what colors did Van Gogh use to create that lovely soft teal?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I might be able to dig up a paper on it to see what he used in his skies and in other places where he used that. I presume you're talking about the kind of the greenish duck eggy blue color, but I don't know off the top of my head.
That's all right. You don't have to know every single thing about color. But no, you are the queen of color. Let's see. Is absinthe as a pigment derived from the same sources as used for the drink?
No, I don't believe it is. So absinthe, the drink, was made sort of using these sort of botanical ingredients, and it was initially said to have great medicinal use, and the alcohol was supposedly beside the point. But then, as we all know, the alcohol became very much the point. I'm not too sure what chemicals went into the making of the absinthe pigment, but I would imagine it was a synthetic. What's really a kind of a great but also quite confounding thing about looking into color is that very often the names and the terms used are very slippery and are recycled. So you get this, you get names being used for lots of different, you get the same names being used for lots of different pigments, and you also find pigments that are very similar, or nearly identical, showing up under lots of different aliases. And these names can shift over time. So, you have to be careful with books like Cennini's, because they might call, they might sort of talk about a particular pigment or a particular paint that they're using, and the name that they use might not be the name that an artist 100 years later, it might not be the same, might have changed over time, which makes color fascinating, but also full of pitfalls and blind alleys.
Yep. So this is a good question. What was the replacement for Mummy Brown?
Well, I mean, it's one of those things, actually brown is a really easy color to make. You can, most of the time you make it by accident, even when you're not trying to make it. So there was not really a specific need for a brown pigment, and a lot of artists made their own. Some artists particularly used Mummy Brown because it came from mummies, those that knew about its provenance, used it. And again, this idea of sympathetic magic, they liked the idea that they were putting something like that on their canvases, and there's this idea that it was giving, it was lending some sort of prestige and authenticity to their art. But it was also talked about quite often as having, being a really wonderful translucent brown pigment, and being a good pigment to use if you wanted to add depth and shadow, particularly if you were sort of painting a darkened room and you wanted to give that illusion of space and depth. Quite often, Mummy Brown was one of the pigments that was praised for its translucency. However, because it was prepared, very differently, and because mummification, the methods used changed a lot over time. This was, the methods of preparation and the different materials and substances used varied a lot over the 2,000 years in which mummification, was commonly used in Egypt. The pigment itself would vary an awful lot as well, of course. So, it would never have been the most reliable of pigments. And so I imagine, artists probably, some used it for the shock value, some used it because it was their novelty perhaps, but I can't imagine it was a great pigment to use, even if you could get past where it came from.
Yeah, I wonder how many people stopped using it after they found out where it did come from, buried there.
What worries me is I wonder how many people started using it when they found out where it came from.
Okay, so what is the most coveted, excuse me, or expensive color today, and why?
Ooh, so I should think probably the answer to that is ultra blacks. So colors, pigments like, not pigments, but colors or materials like Banter black, which stands for vertically aligned nanotube array, which is an ultra black coating that was initially developed for the interiors of satellite positioning systems, because it's incredibly efficient at absorbing light. It absorbs about 99.965% of the visible spectrum. And I would imagine that is the most expensive color available today. Not only is it, obviously not made by very many people, you need specialist equipment to make it, but it's also incredibly fragile because it owes its color to its structure, these kind of vertical tubes, rather like a kind of field of grass made out of carbon nanotubes. That's what it is that creates this ultra black. If you touch the surface coated with carbon nanotubes, it breaks the nanotubes and destroys the ultra black effect. So I would imagine that is the most expensive color there is around. Although I also spoke to an incredible scientist who is working on color, called Mas Subramanian. He works out of the University of Oregon. It was him who was responsible for Yin Min Blue, which got quite a lot of headlines recently as being the first new blue to have been discovered in 200 years. He is also currently working on a red, because believe it or not, really color fast, bright, permanent red pigments that are affordable are still quite difficult to come by. He gave me the example of the I Heart New York or I Heart Paris or I Heart London signs that you quite often see in people's windows. If they're there for a long time, you'll notice the I and the New York or NY last for much longer than the heart. The heart will generally start fading away quite quickly. And so there is an appetite, a desire to create a better red pigment that could withstand light more readily. And they have great trouble creating really good red pigments for cars, for example. You have to apply the red and then apply special UV coatings over the top. Otherwise, the red fades over time.
Wow. Well, I know there's like 67 more questions behind this one, but it's 1 o'clock. And Kathy, I just wanted to, I know you come on board, say your thing, but thank you so much, Cassia, for joining us. It was so wonderful. There's lots of people who are thanking you in the chat box and also feeling like they're back in school, which is
not back in school. It's like having like it's like color therapy. It's like, oh my God, this is so amazing.
No, it's a good.
Thank you. Feel free to stick around. We got a few more things that we're going to go through. But also if you need to dash, that's not a problem. Just to let everybody know, we are also getting Kassia St Clair's second book called A Golden Thread, or The Golden Thread?
The Golden Thread.
The Golden Thread. So that will be on the site once we receive it. And then we do have copies of The Secret Lives of Color, Know You in Color available. And like I read it again last night. I was just so thrilled to be actually having you be with us today, and thank you again. It was just fantastic.
It was my absolute pleasure. I hope that I've selected a good 5 colors for you and I didn't manage to rush through them too fast. Like I said, there are 75 in the book, so you've got 70 more to discover in the book itself.
Excellent.
Thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you for your great questions. I'm sorry if I didn't get to them all. But yes, you can, if you're interested, I do write a newsletter, which you can find on my website, which is pretty infrequent, but I talk about color and what I'm working on, next.
Great.
At the moment.
So go to Kassia's website will be in the chat. Also, it'll be in the information that we send around. And I highly encourage you to sign up for her newsletter and find out what's going on next in the world of color. Thank you again, Kassia.
Thank you so much, and have a good day, everyone. I've got to go and feed my dog, who you may have heard squeaking her toys during the talk.
And the storm, and it's wine time.
But I didn't think it was
great.
Toys.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. All right, guys. Thank you. Wow, that was great. Okay, don't forget to stay tuned for Picture of the Week.
Week.
We've got a natural dyer joining us from Zagreb, Croatia, to speak about her picture. And then the other thing, there's a couple of reminders. We do have a new seasonal color wheel from Sasha Durr for the Pacific Northwest. Yay! We're in the house. Everybody's now asking about other regions. I know she does have a Midwest edition coming up, and then she also mentioned one other one, but I don't remember what it is. So if you're feeling left out, don't feel left out, because she is making her way across North America and beyond. Also, we are going to be opening up some new indigo classes with Abu Bakar Fofana starting next week, so look for those. I'm still kind of nailing down dates. We're going to start in May and he's going to give a series of different workshops, indigo, mineral mud dyeing, and then a couple of really interesting construction and stitching classes. Stitching techniques to do specific Dogon style shibori stitch resist. It's not really shibori, but I mean, shibori is the term we're going to use for it, but it's West African style stitch resist, as well as construction techniques for trousers and tunics. If those of you have been following him, you've seen the styles that he makes, and they're really interesting. So he's going to be doing those 3 workshops, as well as his indigo and his mineral mud workshops. Finally, next week, we are going to be having a trio of amazing experts to talk to us about textile conservation and a project that they've been doing for the Thomas Hope furniture in the Cleveland Museum of Art. So we'll be speaking with Robin Hansen, who's mentioned textile conservation, who's managed the Textile Conservation Lab at the Cleveland Museum of Art for the past 21 years, Nancy Britton, who's Conservator Emerita at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, whose specialty is upholstery conservation. Any of you know anything about upholstery is very complicated and fascinating, the materials that they use. And Kate Smith, who's owner of the Eaton Hill Textile Works and the director of the Marshfield School of Weaving in Marshfield, Vermont. These 3 women are going to jointly present a collaborative reupholstery project that they've done together, with the focus of their presentation on a piece from the Thomas Hope furniture in the Cleveland Museum's collection, and a bench also by Thomas Hope in the Metropolitan Museum's collection. Kate dyed the yarn and wove the fabric for both projects, and they'll focus on the process as well as how important it is to keep this type of natural dye and textile conservation alive and well. And that is next week, next Feedback Friday. We will have the RSVP for you in the video link that we send around. And now Amy is going to talk about picture of the
week. Ridiculous. Okay, I see you, Vedrana. Pichek. You better unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm here.
Okay, let me see. I'm going to share the screen. And I just figured out the easiest way to do this would just be to show your Instagram, the Instagram page.
Yeah, that's the easiest way, basically, yeah.
So, and hopefully you guys don't see these other things that are popping up on the screen. But yeah, I saw, so Vedrana had tagged botanical colors in this picture, and I was reading it, and I thought it was so interesting that, you know, thinking about waste and other ways that industries could use waste for dyeing textiles. And some of the pictures that, so this was the first picture. I was like, what's that all about? And then some pictures of where you live.
Yeah.
Zagreb, and then kind of the inside of the bark. But then there was also this other picture I wanted to show. Sorry, guys, I got so many weird things going on here. All right, I think it was, am I going the wrong way? Hold on. Here it is. Here it is.
Yeah, it's here.
So this was the yarn that you ended up dyeing with that. Yep. So why don't you tell us more about what you did and why you think that you know, we should be using waste more as part of textile.
Well, for me, because I live in that area, it's easy to find waste like bark of the trees or like plants that are just like growing here. But to use waste, we could use like food waste, onion skins, which I also collect. So it's like easy access for us to use to dye textiles or yarns or anything. And I think if people got more like together to, I don't know, I was thinking about restaurants making food, so they obviously have waste that is being thrown, but we could use it for textiles. So that's like my way of thinking about using waste in design altogether, for fashion design or anything. So that was like my way of like considering just using what I have around me in my art and design. So in short,
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
that
I
would
know.
be it.
And then as part of that exhibit that you're in right now too, did you want to talk about
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
I don't know.
Well, for that exhibit, which is the one with the frame, that one, yes. So as it says here that it's a part of like my uni project where we were working on an exhibition which is inspired by Judith Scott, and she used textile to wrap like everyday objects to express herself. And I decided to use the yarn which I dyed before to like wrap it around the frame, the background of the frame. So I also like create a new way of bark to how to say, I took it off the branch and I wrapped it around, so it also like how to say, it became the bark again, but in a new way, in a new form. So that was like taking it off and putting it back on something. So that was also like the wrapping part, but also thinking about the cycle of nature and how like it protects the thing inside the bark. So it's like a cycle in a way. Yeah, it's hard to explain it, but
And
that's it.
What's the university that you're going to?
It's the Textile and Technology uni here in Zagreb. It's like the only university of that kind in our country and one of the biggest in this part of Europe. So yeah. And I'm studying textile design, but that's like my focus. And I just fashion design as well a bit.
50 years old thinking about all these things.
Yeah. Well, somebody has to.
Somebody has to. You're in good company here with people
Yeah.
who are all thinking about.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for.
And I also have here, I could just show the book we were talking about with the samples.
Yeah, I think your swatch book
Yeah,
is
I have it here.
one of the best I've seen.
I'm just gonna
get inspired.
If you can see, I was making some dyes today and I have over like 44 samples of dyes. So these are like the ones I'm going to bring to my professor at uni, but these are like, it's like a sample book of my work from like the past year. So this is just the part of it, not all of them, but just like, but that's it. And I even did like the hand binding and everything, so it looks cute.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. So thank you for joining and giving me a chance to share my work a bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hey, will you do me a favor and put your Instagram name inside the chat too, so people want
to. Yes. I'm just gonna.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thanks. And like I said,
there it is.
Yeah. Yep. I know. I remember. I thought your last name was Pond, which was.
It's not.
Not the case. Well, thanks. And so follow Vedrana, and see all the great work that she's doing.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I like that. It's so funny. I can see like some of you guys, and I just see Kathy Green just like smiling the whole time. Kathy, you're always just smiling. I love it. All right. So I don't know. Did Kathy take off on us? Kathy, you still here? Maybe she took off. Wow, Kathy just split town on us. Well, if you guys want to unmute yourselves and say hello to each other, go for it.
Hello, hello. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you next Friday.
Thank you. Spring, Maryland. Bye.
Thank
you.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you,
Amy. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Amy, you're always smiling too.
Thanks, Betsy. I get excited, all these interesting projects that are happening, and
Hey, Amy, last week, Kathy mentioned a workshop or some kind of seminar for growing indigo and starting it and then moving through the process.
it's going to be put on hold, Cynthia, for a little bit until maybe later spring. We just only so many things you can do, during all this madness. So we're gonna just hold on that one, but it's ready to be put into place. It's just kind of,
Because I'm thinking here in Seattle, I need to start my seeds inside now. So